MND is an incredibly cruel disease, and with Wendy we learned that she had MND in November 2012, and we were worried about it. We didn't know what it was. We thought perhaps it was even MS or something like that, but she'd been stumbling a lot and her voice was getting slightly kind of mumbled almost, but we didn't suspect that. And then we went to our consultant and he broke the news to us, and that was devastating, there's no doubt about it. And with hindsight, one can reckon that she probably had it for 3 years or so, and it's just been slowly developing to that point. And after that, it was very fast. And of course, MND is basically the collapse and failure of the motor neuron system. And so that it basically means that the different kind of limbs and muscles fail, and everyone can have slightly different kinds of MND. In Wendy's case, very, very quickly, she started losing the command of her voice so that she couldn't speak. And I think that's one of the cruelest things of the lot. And she was communicating entirely by writing. She then found it increasingly difficult to walk, but we kept going. And then through that, there's just a steady failure. And the cruel thing of motor neurone disease is that there's no going back. And you know that. There's no recovery. There can be, or you can hope for, troughs and periods of slight respite. Wendy never had that. And so the disease for her lasted just about 18 months before she finally died. And by the end of that 18 months, she needed 24-hour care. She could still write to the end. She had just enough strength in her arms to hold to a kind of a little device for actually standing up, and then she could be helped up and moved and sit down again. But even that was going. And she was getting to the point as well where she could no longer write. She never liked a tablet, and she wrote everything. And I've got a whole mass of notebooks of where she was replying to requests, but it became harder and harder for her to do that as well. And finally, I think she kept fighting it right to the end, but I think she fought it through always thinking of other people much more than she ever thought of herself. And it was amazing, even with our carers. And she'd indicate if they needed help or you weren't, and she'd kind of gesture saying, that I really had to pay attention to that person and help her or whatever it was. And she kept her interest and her love of the people around her right to the end. And then finally, I think she decided that it had gone on enough, and even, just hours before she finally slipped away, she was actually, she was in control right the way through. And I think that's one of the things with motor neurone disease, because of course the mind isn't affected at all. So it's the position of a body that is failing around you, and the mind's as good as it was, but the mind is being trapped more and more and more into that body that had failed. And finally, she'd been getting very, very weak. And finally, with her at home, she slipped off, and she was dead. And she was just incredibly courageous through it. And certainly, I've seen what motor neurone disease can do to people, and friends of ours have had it as well, or have it and have died. And I'd like to do, and I do hope that everyone here can actually give generously. And this is, if you like, my present from Lancaster University. not a kind of a picture or anything like that, but actually a really good, substantial contribution to try to find a cure for this dreadful disease.